The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon to everyone, or good evening or morning, depending on where you are joining us in the world. My name is Mark Canavera, and I'm the Associate Director of the Care and Protection of Children, or CPC Learning Network. We are very excited to be able to present today's webinar, which is bringing together a real panel of experts on a topic that we think is very important and that is occurring domestically here in the United States, where the CPC Learning Network Secretariat is housed, but really has global ramifications. The issue, of course, is the surge of refugee youth who are reaching the United States from a set of countries in Central America, the so-called Northern Triangle countries. To talk about those today, we have four different experts who have different perspectives that are very complementary. We will start with Eric Hirschberg and Dennis Stinchcomb of American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. We will then hear from Jayesh Rathod, who is a professor of law at American University as well. And finally, from Alyssa Steglish, who is a professor at the University of Texas. To launch this conversation, we'll hear from Eric and Dennis. Before I introduce them, I just did want to let our participants know that the webinar will be recorded and shared afterwards with some of the resources that we reference. And also that if you have questions that you would like to send to the participants, and we encourage you to do so, please use the question or the chat box. Both of those will reach us and we'll bring them back to the presenters. You can write them in at any point and we'll have our eye on those and get them to them. We will do short clarifying questions after each set of presentations. We will start with Eric and Dennis, do some clarifying questions, move on to Jayesh, do some clarifying questions, and finish with Alyssa. And then we will open it up to conversation. We hope that the presentations will be done in about an hour so that we then have a good half an hour for discussion among you. We had a lot of interest in this webinar, so we know that it's a topic that's of interest to people. With no further ado then, Eric Hirschberg is the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies and a professor of government at American University. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has taught at New York University, NYU, Southern Illinois University, Columbia, Princeton, and the New School. From 2007 to 2009, he was the professor of political science and the director of the Latin American Studies of Latin American Studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Prior to arriving there, he served for 15 years as a program director at the Social Science Research Council here in New York City. His research focuses on the comparative politics of Latin America and on the politics of development. His current research projects analyze the state of democracy and emerging development strategies in South America, as well as the ways in which elites exercise power in Central America. For his presentation, he'll be joined by Dennis Stinchcomb, who is the Assistant Director for Research at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. Dennis joined the staff there in May of 2012 after completing graduate work in Spanish and Latin American Studies at the same university. He currently manages several projects within the center, including their portfolio of research on immigration-related issues and Central American gangs. These are issues that we all hear about in the news daily, and many people have developed very strong opinions about, but what I think you'll appreciate from this introductory presentation is the scientific and analytical approach that these two individuals bring to it. With no further ado, over to Eric and Dennis.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. This is Eric Hirschberg, as he said, from the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. And together with Dennis, as well as with Jayesh Rathod, who will intervene in a bit later in this presentation, we're doing quite a bit of work on contemporary Central American political economy and security issues, and from that have been carrying out a series of research projects looking at the processes of migration, as well as a separate question is what happens with these populations once they arrive in the United States. Some of our work that we will present today is an updated version of a report that Dennis and I published in 2014 under the auspices of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies here at AU, that looks at the drivers of migration from Central America, and particularly of youth and family migration. And I understand that the invitation to this webinar included a link to that report, and so definitely feel free to consult that. It's a resource that we hope can be widely used by advocates, by people in policy networks who are concerned with this very important set of challenges regarding migrant youth and families from Central America arriving in the United States. And as we will suggest in this presentation, not only the United States now as the destinations for the outflows of population from Central America are increasingly diverse, and we'll say a little bit about that. With that by way of introduction, I'll pass it along to Dennis to put this in context, and then I will say a little bit, he'll then turn to me to discuss some of the local conditions in Central America that help us to understand the increase in the volume of migration over the last 5 years.
Great, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Mark, for the introduction and for pulling this together. I think that we're equally excited about being able to share our work and also to incorporate colleagues from other institutions. It's great to have Alyssa join us as well. So I'm just going to jump right in and give just a few slides of context, basically talking about statistics about where this population is from and what size of population are we talking about. So we're talking about the Northern Triangle, the region of Central America. Central America has for decades suffered from endemic poverty, episodes of armed conflict, and pervasive impunity for corruption and violence that's fueled successive waves of migration, largely to the United States. Today, a confluence of factors has triggered a mass exodus from the region, specifically from the so-called Northern Triangle countries, which are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras that you see there on the map, just south of Mexico. Comprised primarily of youth and mothers with children, these Central Americans arrive at the U.S. border categorized typically as unaccompanied alien children, or UACs, and family units if it's a mother that is traveling with her children. As acknowledged in 2015 by the then United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the Portuguese diplomat Antonio Guterres said the Northern Triangle is not merely the source of migration flows, but rather the site of an increasingly urgent refugee crisis. And so that's kind of the framing of this presentation, that really with this population, despite the current administration's take that this is a humanitarian and refugee crisis. The scale of the problem is evident upon reviewing the numbers of unaccompanied youth and family units apprehended at the U.S. border. Since October 2009, over 300,000 unaccompanied youth have been apprehended at the U.S.'s southern border with Mexico. Nearly 200,000 of these youth were from the Northern Triangle, and the majority have arrived within the last 4 years, either during or following that unprecedented surge that you see there on the graphic in the summer of 2014. And perhaps during the question time, we can talk more about what the variations in the trends that we've seen after that point, the sharp decline in the fall of 2014, largely due to the US's pressure on Mexico to police its own border with Guatemala and to ramp up enforcement efforts within its own borders. We talked in the surge of 2014, there was a lot of focus on unaccompanied youth, and the family units kind of were pushed aside and there wasn't much attention. But in this graph, you can see that the number of family members that comprise the family units that have been apprehended are fairly the same as the numbers of the unaccompanied kids. And in the most recent year, in 2000, and the fiscal year 2016 actually exceeded the number of unaccompanied kids. So in fiscal year 2016, roughly 80% of all the unaccompanied children and 90% of all family units that were apprehended were from Central American countries. That's just under 60,000 unaccompanied kids in FY16 and 77,000 family members. And I thought that these slides were helpful because sometimes we lose focus on the age groups. What actually, when we use the term unaccompanied children, we sometimes think that these are extremely young kids that are crossing, but it's important to remember that over 2/3 are adolescent age youth between the ages of 15 and 17. However, nearly 1 in 5 still is below the age of 12, and when they're apprehended without being in the custody of the parent or another adult. And males account for roughly 2/3 of the UAC population. The U.S. is the principal destination, in part because it's here that refugees have family members and other contacts who can conceivably assist their integration into a safer environment. Civil wars in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, in which the United States intervened during the 1980s as an arena during its Cold War competition in the Americas with the Soviet Union and Cuba, accounted for an initial wave of migration. And you can see how the foreign-born population from Central America that's residing in the U.S. has grown exponentially since 1970, tripling in size from 1970 to 1990, and then tripling again by 2010. Other subsequent flows have been in response to economic hardship in the region and a succession of natural disasters. Tens of thousands of Central Americans received temporary protected status, or TPS, in the United States beginning in 1999. And the U.S. government acknowledged that in the wake of displacements caused by these natural disasters, countries in the region were ill-equipped to receive and reintegrate populations that had migrated to the U.S. Today, 195,000 Salvadorans and 57,000 Hondurans remain in the United States legally under TPS, which is up for renewal in early 2018. The Trump administration has not yet announced whether it's going to extend TPS for Hondurans and for Nicaraguans, which are the 2 Central American countries with TPS, for another 18-month period. We're actually expecting a decision in the next couple of days, if not weeks. And just another comment on TPS is that the current administration did decide not to extend TPS for Haitians beyond this year. And so I think that gives us an indication that there might be a cause for concern when we think about whether TPS is going to be renewed for Hondurans and for Salvadorans. And now I'm going to switch it over to Eric.
Yes, well, thank you, Dennis. Just a clarification on the TPS. It's in the next few days that we expect to hear whether there's a renewal of TPS for Hondurans and Nicaraguans. Soon after the new year, we'll hear about that with regard to Salvadorans. Again, because the administration needs to provide notice within 60 days of the expiration of temporary protected status as to whether it intends to recertify the home countries as ill-equipped to integrate those populations. And so we're 60 days away in the Honduran and Nicaraguan cases, and soon we will be in the Salvadoran as well. I want to turn, Dennis has pointed out the number of factors that account for migration to the United States beginning in the 70s and particularly in the 1980s from Central America. But if the drivers of migration in the past were war, economic hardship, and natural disasters. In recent years, new kinds of violence have swept the Northern Triangle, and these cause significant displacement. The extent of violence in nominally peaceful times is evident in high homicide rates, as you'll see in this graph. Now, the data show modest reductions in Honduras recently, as over the past couple of years, it has lost its lost to El Salvador, the ignoble status as the homicide capital of the world. But critics point to the militarization of policing and rampant rights abuses by security forces there. While Honduras has experienced some reduction in homicide rates, El Salvador and Guatemala both reflect modest reductions very recently, but still at astronomically high rates. And in both countries, NGOs and monitoring agencies find similar degrees, as in Honduras, of impunity enjoyed by security officials. And homicide and impunity of security forces are but the most glaring indicators of pervasive violence that makes remaining in one's community of origin untenable for growing portions of the population, particularly for youth. And we would make the argument that this is much of what accounts for the spike in migration that Dennis described over the past 5 years. Another indicator of violence is the frequency and severity of household violence, along with the lack of institutional capacity to address it. Domestic violence further propels migration in the region, from the region. Even more important is the trend whereby dysfunctional, underfinanced states cede control of territories and the population living within those territories to criminal gangs that impose their will through coercion. The proliferation of gangs in the region is absolutely central to understanding the significant uptick in the flow of youth and family migration in recent years. Now, Central American gangs, such as the MS-13 and the 18th Street, or Barrio 18, trace their origins to exile communities in Los Angeles. You'll recall from our earlier charts that the flow of migrants into the United States, particularly major cities such as Los Angeles, goes back to the 70s and particularly the 80s. And it's during the 1980s that newly arrived Central American youth found themselves confronted by established gangs, and they founded gangs of their own in response. And so beginning in the mid-90s, we see an increase in the deportation of individuals charged with criminal offenses affiliated with gangs in the United States. And they're deported back to Central America, often to countries with which they maintain very, very little by way of social ties. And their arrival in the region, in effect, replicates the gang phenomenon that we saw in such cities as Los Angeles. And so, having just emerged from decades of internal conflict and plagued by pervasive underemployment, nascent democracies in places like El Salvador and Guatemala were entirely unequipped to offer returning youth a viable alternative, and the gang membership in the Northern Triangle itself swelled in part as a result. Children and families are paying the price very directly as gang violence reaches epidemic proportion. They're increasingly used by gangs to monitor territories, sell drugs, and collect extortion payments. When they resist being coerced into serving as the gang's foot soldiers, the consequences can be gruesome. And you see here in this slide a note that was sent to a young Guatemalan who we advocated for in an asylum case here in the United States. And it's a crude but powerful note that makes clear why it is that this young man, this 19-year-old Guatemalan, urgently needed to leave his community owing to threats from the 18th Street gang that was demanding that he pay them $40 a week, and indicating that if he did not do so or went to the police, they would promise him they would kill him and his entire family. And it's in this context that tens of thousands of young Central Americans are seeking asylum abroad. They complain of being unable to venture out in public, walk to school, engage in work, since leaving the relative safety of their homes exposes them to forced recruitment and to extortion payments from the gangs. Extortion is critical here. Extortion payments, which are known in the region as la renta, the quota, as it were, are extracted by force and threats of brutality. They embody gang control and provide economic foundation for the gangs, which derive sustenance from resources coerced from an already squeezed population. In societies such as El Salvador, where more than a quarter of the population resides today in the United States, and is known to send remittances back home to support relatives who stayed behind, those relatives are especially vulnerable to extortion from gangs, as the gangs know that there are resources in the United States, and they demand that the relatives abroad provide payments in exchange for the safety of their kin. The Northern Triangle is plagued by endemic levels of gender-based violence as well, and much of that is also perpetrated by gangs. Consistent with broader gender inequalities throughout the region, female adolescents and girls are often targeted by gangs and organized criminal groups to be trafficked for commercial sex acts, forced into prostitution rings, and are at times kidnapped and raped by groups of gang members. Women associated with a particular gang are often in turn targeted by rivals, and others may be raped and killed as part of gang initiation rites or as a means of strengthening ties between gang members. Ideally, one would be able to rely on the security forces, law enforcement agencies for protection. However, corruption in underpaid and poorly trained security forces reinforces the defenselessness of many Central Americans. Authorities who do choose to take on the gangs or criminal networks are themselves at risk, as are their families. Indeed, in recent years, we've seen steep spikes in the murder of police and law enforcement officials, particularly in El Salvador. And this is in large part the result of increased confrontation between gangs and members of the civilian police force. Salvadoran police officers have been given express permission to shoot perceived criminals with no adverse consequences, leading many to characterize an increasing number of police-perpetrated fatalities as extrajudicial killings. But at the same time that we have the problem of extrajudicial killings carried out by security forces, we find gangs responding to this by terrorizing and targeting law enforcement agents and their families. And interestingly, we're seeing families targeted even after the member of the police has themselves been killed. And these are among the factors that are leading Central American youth, women, and families to conclude that they lack what we sometimes refer to as the right not to migrate. In societies where one's exposure to extreme levels of violence, one's lack of minimal employment or educational opportunities, and one's vulnerability to a state and economic elites that operate with complete impunity, completely outside the law. Those are contexts in which vulnerable populations do not have the right not to migrate. And we think this is a very important way to think about about the humanitarian crisis that we're facing in the United States as a result of the mass migration of what is, for the most part, a refugee population. These factors, the violence, the impunity, economic exclusion, are also the factors that motivate relatives abroad to send for Central American youth and families in order to achieve their safety and to protect what are nowadays transnational households from incessant extortion. And the costs to these families are enormous. Coyotes, that is the human smugglers, people who bring youth and families from Central America through Mexico and then to the United States border, charge anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 to deliver a migrant to the United States. And these are very heavy costs for working families to bear. And the fact that they do so testifies, in our view, to the urgency of the challenges faced by members of their household based in Central America. And traversing violence-ridden Mexico typically takes weeks to months, during which migrants are also subject to a range of dangers. Women are especially vulnerable, but young men also are at the mercy of criminal networks as they try to navigate across Mexico. Also consequential for Central Americans trying to journey from their countries of origin to the United States are Mexican measures encouraged by the United States government to detain Central Americans before they reach the United States border. Detentions of child migrants by Mexican authorities have increased by over 315%, from just under 10,000 in 2013 to over 40,000 in 2016. The cargo trains, known as La Bestia, were for a long time the notorious means for Central Americans to reach the United States border, but this has largely been made impassable. The United States and Mexican authorities have tried to close off access to the cargo trains. And in that context, a network of guides, or coyotes, transport minors and families using buses, storage vehicles, and often on foot across territories in Mexico, frequently that are under the control of organized crime groups, on their way in a hazardous journey to the United States border. Now, despite these hazards, youth and families continue to risk the trek from their communities of origin through Mexico. Strikingly, though, as the perception grows that the U.S. border is increasingly impermeable, and that those who manage to enter the states may quickly be deported regardless of the merit of their claims for protection, the number of Central American refugees seeking asylum elsewhere are skyrocketing. This is actually very important. As the United States pursues an increasingly draconian policy of repression in order to discourage migration, it is not the case that Central Americans therefore do not leave. It is rather that they leave and head elsewhere. That is, again, evidence that the right not to migrate is what is lacking here. And what we're seeing then is a growing flow of asylum requests to other countries in the region. And here we see Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Belize. A recent study by a Salvadoran think tank, INCIDE, had remarkable findings showing an unprecedented migration of rural Salvadorans to impoverished zones of rural Nicaragua. And this is striking because up until now, even the poorest Salvadorans were never in the past known to migrate to rural Nicaragua. And clearly what is at play here is escape from violence. And in places like El Salvador, that violence is now no longer concentrated only in urban areas or the slums that dot the urban periphery of the capital city of San Salvador, but they're also reaching the most remote parts of rural El Salvador, where previously the gangs had limited reach. Now, if the rhetoric of political leaders in the U.S. and the actions of criminal groups and agents of the state in Mexico may slow the influx across the borders with Texas and Arizona, there's no sign of their staunching the conditions that drive the exodus from the Northern Triangle. And there shouldn't be any expectation that policies put forth to ameliorate the conditions that propel the migration will have much of a positive impact, at least over the short to the medium term. And let me mention two different approaches toward trying to deal with these drivers of migration. The first is the Plan for the Alliance for Prosperity. Now, it's often supposed that development assistance aimed at promoting growth and strengthening institutions will catalyze changes in the Northern Triangle that would remove the incentives for migration. And this is the principal assumption guiding the Plan for the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle, which was agreed upon by the three countries' presidents, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Obama administration in late 2014. And some of the $1 billion allocated by the IDB and the more than $600 million pledged by the U.S. government has now begun to flow to the region. The aim is to bolster infrastructure needed to spur private sector growth and job creation, to provide youth opportunities, and to reform security forces and judicial institutions in order to reduce crime and violence. So this is one approach that policymakers are taking, and that they hope, though I'm rather skeptical, will have a significant impact on the conditions driving migration. A second approach has to do with commissions designed to reduce corruption and impunity. And there are important efforts underway to provide international support that would empower domestic institutions to investigate and prosecute malfeasance by government officials whose corruption has reached monumental proportions and which, by all accounts, is undermining the capacity for effective governance throughout the Northern Triangle. And absent effective governance, you're not going to find successful measures to regain some degree of security in the context of the criminal dynamics that I described earlier. And most notable among the anti-corruption and anti-impunity commissions are the UN-sponsored Commission Against Corruption and Impunity in Guatemala, the CICIG, and the OAS-supported Mission Against Corruption and Impunity in Honduras, known as the MAXI. And the CICIG has already facilitated the prosecution of a sitting president and vice president in a massive extortion and bribery scheme. And it's now targeting the incumbent president, who is alleged to have financed his campaign through contributions from narco traffickers. In response, the president has sought to expel from the country the director of the CICIG, and we're seeing similar efforts by the incumbent president in Honduras and the ruling party in Honduras to undermine the work of the MAXI in that country. And this actually brings together the grounds for my skepticism about the prospects of either the Plan Alianza or the anti-impunity commissions having a lasting impact on the drivers of migration. When we look at it, a central problem in the region is the absence of states that are capable of providing the basic public goods that populations require in order to sustain minimally viable conditions of life. And this is a result of, on the one hand, the inability of states to raise resources from the wealthy, and on the other hand, the inability of states which is related, to develop the institutional capacities needed to provide basic public goods. And I'll close this part of the presentation simply by calling your attention to data this is from 2014, but the numbers have not changed significantly, on the total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, which is a useful indicator of the capacity of the state to provide basic public services. And what you'll see is that the Northern Triangle countries are well below the Latin American and Caribbean average, and indeed they're amongst the lowest in the region. And what this implies is that, a country like Guatemala, with 12% of total tax revenue, 12% of GDP as total tax revenue, that helps you to explain why in a country where more than a third of the youth population is malnourished, we're seeing cuts to the health budget. The failure of these systems to provide basic public services and the failure of the international community's proposals for addressing the situation, be that through the Plan Alianza or be that through the Anti-Corruption Commissions, to address this fundamental question, suggests that the drivers of migration will be with us for some time to come. Let me now turn it to Dennis to say a bit about what happens to these youth, or to Jayesh, excuse me, to say a bit about what happens to these youth once they arrive in the United States. So to my colleague, Professor of Law, Jayesh Rathod.
All right, thank you, Eric. I'm gonna, as Eric mentioned, give a description of the procedures and protections that apply to unaccompanied children that arrive in the United States. And I'm going to begin by discussing some of the procedures that the U.S. government follows when they encounter an unaccompanied child at the border. Now, this is an infographic that generally describes the process, and I'm not going to go through every step that's illustrated here, every subpoint, but just to give you a sense of what happens. As you can imagine, when a child or any other individual comes across the border, the agency that they're likely to interface with first is the Department of Homeland Security, specifically Border Patrol or U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And if there's an unaccompanied child that comes into contact with Border Patrol or another sub-agency of DHS, they'll first undergo some kind of basic kind of health screening. Oftentimes for teenage children, there's some type of testing or questioning that needs to be made to determine whether in fact the child is a minor. You can imagine that many of these children are coming across without documentation, not even a passport or a birth certificate, So there may be questions around their age. And then once some of that initial screening happens, the second agency that becomes involved is the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. And you'll see that the child on step 2 might be transferred to a short-term agency where there's a medical check performed, immunizations, and then a shelter assignment. Now the shelters range in the sense that there are 4 tiers of shelters, and some of them, for example, are specifically for minors who may happen to have some kind of criminal record, or there may be some kinds of security issues related to the minors. There are shelters, for example, that offer services for minors who happen to have their own children or be pregnant. And so there's a range of shelters, and then the child will be placed in the appropriate shelter. At that point, after they're in the shelter, there's going to be work done again with Health and Human Services representatives of the Office of Refugee Resettlement to figure out if there is a sponsor in the United States who can take care of that child. And I'll talk more about who those sponsors are. But caseworkers, individuals affiliated with the Office of Refugee Resettlement will work to identify an appropriate adult living in the United States who can essentially take care of that child. And the child is placed with a relative or other sponsor. Now, something important is that when these children are apprehended by immigration authorities, they are in fact placed in immigration removal proceedings, or as we commonly refer to as deportation proceedings, right? And so part of the role of the sponsor is to ensure that the minor shows up to their immigration court dates in the future. And part of the work that ORR does in some cases is to link the children to legal services, or at least give them suggestions for persons who can provide legal representation. Let me talk a bit more about the sponsors, since they play such an important role in this system. Now, most of the children from Latin America are in fact placed with sponsors who are relatives. And as you know, we have a significant backlog in the immigration court system. Over 600,000 cases are currently pending. And so the kids will sometimes wait years before they actually know what the outcome of their case will be. Since October of 2013, the Office of Refugee Resettlement has placed over 175,000 unaccompanied youth with adult caretakers, and here you can see the geographic distribution of the placements. And about 60% of the youth have in fact been placed in the care of a parent. And so in a sense, although they're initially designated as unaccompanied children, many of them do in fact have relatives in the United States that they're seeking to reunite with. And so the unaccompanied piece is really describing the nature or manner of their entry. Apart from parents, a number of them get placed with other relatives. 13% are placed with aunts or uncles, another 12% with kind of older siblings, and the remainder mostly end up with other types of distant relatives. And there are some challenging dynamics in these reunification situations, right, where parents have been separated from their children for many years, and so it can put some strains on the household, and there's some interesting research that's being done in that regard, including research at the center where Eric and Dennis are located. And you can see some of the top states where these unaccompanied children are being placed include Texas, California, New York, Florida, Maryland, and Virginia. Those 6 states account for 60% of all placements. Now, in addition to this important role that's played by sponsors, there's unfortunately another dynamic that's currently come into play in the current administration, is that the undocumented parent sponsors are now finding themselves at risk for coming out of the shadows and sponsoring their children. So there's a particular irony that on the one hand, the government is asking for parents and other relatives to come forward to serve as the sponsors, but then at the other hand, the Trump administration has launched a new initiative targeting parents who paid smugglers to have their children brought to the United States. And again, these are sometimes parents who have come forth to serve as the sponsors. And since mid-August, there have been several hundred arrests, and this has set off another wave of confusion in the immigrant community. And you can see here a quote of one mother of an unaccompanied minor from Honduras, and you can see that she's saying that I'm illegal and so is my husband, and I've never been worried about losing my children, so worried as I am right now. And there's a description that she offers here about how ICE officers, Immigration Customs Enforcement officers, came to her work site and kind of the fear and panic that that created. And so while this individual has not actually been targeted and arrested by ICE, there are in fact many that have been. And so it's creating some difficulty within the immigrant community, and of course disincentivizing parents and other relatives to come forward and serve as the sponsor, because they would in fact be quote unquote on the radar for immigration enforcement. Another dimension of this program that I'll mention briefly is the Child Advocate Program. This is something that's been around for some time, but it's grown essentially since 2014 after new legislation expanded its use. And this is a program that essentially provides a child advocate to what are called vulnerable unaccompanied children. So these include persons who are minors who are victims of trafficking, who are particularly young, and those in other circumstances. And what happens is that stakeholders, for example, the Office of Refugee Resettlement Provider or staff, or perhaps the attorney, will refer the child to the program, and then they're paired with a child advocate who is typically maybe a social worker or a social work graduate student, some instances law students or retirees. And that individual is charged with providing some services and guidance to the minor, including doing assessments of the minor and their circumstances, gathering information about their case, accompanying them to court. And then also, as many of you know, in the context of working with children, we often have to determine what is the best interest of the child, and the advocates assist with those best interest determinations. All right, well, let me move now to talk about the legal opportunities, right, the legal provisions that these minors have for getting relief, and that's essentially finding a way to remain lawfully in the United States. There are several forms of relief that are available to migrant youth and families under U.S. immigration law, and some of them, of course, you'll be familiar with. I know asylum is universally known, so I won't talk about that in too much detail, but there's three that are a bit more unique to U.S. immigration law. One, which I'll describe more in a moment, is called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. Another is called the U visa. That's for victims of specific crimes who cooperate in the investigation and prosecution of those crimes. And then the T visa, as the letter T suggests, is for victims of a severe form of trafficking in persons, which also applies in some instances to minors who are coming into the United States. As I mentioned, I'll talk more in a moment about special immigrant juvenile status, but I'll also mention that at least until relatively recently, another possibility for these minors was essentially an exercise of prosecutorial discretion. And as you know, in the criminal justice context and also in the immigration context, even though somebody's here unlawfully, doesn't necessarily mean that the government has to go ahead and charge them with a crime or charge them with being here unlawfully. They can kind of just leave them alone and live their life in the United States. And in many cases in the past, minors were benefiting from prosecutorial discretion, though recently the Trump administration has signaled that it really isn't going to be pursuing or agreeing to that kind of prosecutorial discretion in very many cases. Now, before I talk about special immigrant juvenile status, I'll talk a little bit about unaccompanied minors' case outcomes. And you can see here that as of July 2017, 65% of unaccompanied children have secured legal counsel. And the slide here shows that outcomes vary, of course, depending on whether or not they have representation. And the green part of the chart here is showing those who actually were allowed to remain in the United States that were successful in their claims. And the orange is those who were not successful. They either had to remove or chose to leave. And when they're represented, obviously the outcomes are much more favorable. And unfortunately, in the US immigration system, even for children, there is no right to an attorney appointed by the government, except in very limited circumstances in some parts of the country. And so the vast majority of these children have to either find their own lawyer, maybe a nonprofit lawyer, or have to pay for a private attorney. You can again see here some information, as I was saying a moment ago, about the percentage who are represented, unaccompanied youth, a relatively high percentage, and women with children, again, 69% or so are represented, but that still leaves significant numbers who are unrepresented, and many of them do, in fact, have claims for relief. Another bit of data about the applications. Here you can see the asylum applications for individuals from the Northern Triangle and the growth in those applications in the last few years. And I'll mention here that many advocates, including myself, are concerned about some parts of the country because of the lack of representation and also because of the very low asylum grant rates. And we refer to these as asylum-free zones. For example, in Atlanta, the U.S. government data shows that 98% of asylum claims were denied in fiscal year 2015. In Charlotte, for example, 87% were denied, which is much higher than the national average of 48% denial for asylum claims. So there are a number of structural features in the refugee protection system that is challenging the ability of Central Americans to access their humanitarian protections, including asylum, right? And so this is something that advocates, we are looking at very carefully to see how we can kind of overcome these structural barriers and provide representation and overcome the systemic challenges as well. Now, I'll close by talking just a bit about special immigrant juvenile status. In immigration law, we have different green card categories, and one of them refers to special immigrants, and that is subdivided into a number of subcategories, including special immigrant juveniles. This is something that's been in high demand recently, such that kind of the statutory caps, limits that exist have been met in recent years, and it's created some delays. Now, briefly, what do you have to show in order to qualify for a special immigrant juvenile visa? You have to show some basic information such as being unmarried and under 21, but you also have to establish that reunification is not viable with one or both parents due to abandonment, abuse, or neglect as determined by the law in your local jurisdiction. And it's also important to note that special immigrant juvenile status can't solely be used to obtain immigration status, that there has to be another reason, for example, getting certainty with respect to custody or who's caring for the child, that has to also be in play. And so it's typically a two-step process. The first is that the juvenile needs to go to family court, and with the help of an attorney, that case is brought by an adult or another entity that's seeking to have custody of the minor or maybe to have the child placed with a state agency. And so in the family court, that child has to be declared dependent on the court or, as I mentioned, being placed in the custody of an individual or a private agency or a state agency. The family court judge also has to find that it's not in the child's best interest to return to the country of origin, and also has to find that reunification is not possible with one or both parents due to those factors that I mentioned. And then once that's completed and the family court issues what's called a predicate order, the next step is for the minor with his or her attorney to file a petition with the immigration agency, and that will ultimately lead to a pathway to a green card. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Jayesh. And before we go to our final presenter, I do want to introduce our last speaker and the forthcoming one. Jayesh Rathod is a law professor at American University, Washington College of Law, where he's the founding director of the law school's Immigrant Justice Clinic. His areas of expertise and scholarly interests include immigration law, labor and employment law, occupational safety and health, and clinical legal education. Before Jayesh joined the faculty, he was a staff attorney at CASA of Maryland, where he represented low-wage immigrant workers on employment law and immigration matters, and participated in worker education, organizing, and advocacy efforts. He also practiced law in the litigation section at Wilmer, Cutler and Pickering, LLP, and was law clerk to the Honorable Louis F. Oberdorfer of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and is a graduate of Columbia Law School and Harvard College. If you have clarifying questions for Jayesh, please feel free to type them in right now. We can tackle them while I introduce Alyssa. And please also do think about some broader questions that may bring elements that are linked to all of the presentations together. The one that I see there does seem like one of those broader questions. One just popped up, so we'll bring that in at the end. To introduce our final speaker, Alyssa Steglish currently teaches and supervises students at the Immigration Clinic of the University of Texas School of Law, where she is a clinical professor. In her over 15 years advocating for immigrant rights, especially the rights of immigrant children, she has provided direct representation to asylum seekers, immigrant children, and immigrant victims of violence and human trafficking. In addition, Professor Steglish has trained pro bono attorneys, state court judges, and child welfare workers and administrators on legal protections available to immigrant children. She currently serves on the board of the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. And I'm just going to double check, no clarifying questions yet. So with no more delay, our last presenter, Alyssa, Professor Steglish.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I want to return us to 2014 when we saw the increased number of Central American protection seekers arriving at the southern border. And while the Obama administration initially responded with humanitarian concerns, they quickly flipped into a national security framework. And the administration claimed that these new arrivals were economic migrants without valid asylum claims. And they also came out, the administration was very clear in messaging deterrence. You'll see the quote from Jay Johnson, who was at that time Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, very clearly stating to those migrants in transit or those who are contemplating fleeing that we will send you back. People in Central America should see and will see that if they make this journey and spend several $1,000s to do that, we will send them back and they will have wasted their money, thus foreclosing and giving prejudice to their initial very valid asylum claims. The policy of deterrence took shape in a couple of different ways. U.S. immigration law actually provided an easy, although expensive, national security-based solution. The administration used what's called expedited removal in an attempt to quickly turn back the asylum seekers who were coming mostly from Central America. And under expedited removal, which has been part of the U.S. immigration law since 1996, anyone apprehended within 100 miles of the border and within 14 days of entry can be summarily deported without seeing a judge. It's only the border officer who makes that decision. It's not subject to any judicial oversight. Now, due to the U.S. international legal obligations under the Convention Against Torture, under the Refugee Protocol, if an immigrant claims that they will be harmed or tortured in their home countries, the Department of Homeland Security must provide an initial screening of that protection claim, even in the context of expedited removal. So the law allows for, but the law allows for detention during the screening phase. So if an immigrant passes that screening phase, they will be able to present an asylum application to an immigration judge, but they will be detained throughout the process until they get to pass the screening phase. Now, due to separate legal protections for unaccompanied children in federal law, unaccompanied children were not subject to this expedited removal, but children arriving with their mothers were. And so in June 2014, the administration repurposed a massive law enforcement training center in Artesia, New Mexico, which is in the middle of nowhere, 5 hours from the closest legal service provider, to detain almost 700 mothers and children. Even those families who then passed the initial screening in the expedited removal process, the department refused to release them, and they stated that they were refusing to release them in this no bond policy, no release policy, in order to send a message to other migrants. Our clinic at the University of Texas, together with co-counsel, actually litigated the issue, arguing that detention based on deterrence was unlawful, that there needs to be kind of an individualized consideration of factors, but it can't be based on a policy of deterrence. And in fact, the federal court agreed in the case of RILR. Now, in the wake of that decision, the administration did not stop the practice. In fact, new contracts with for-profit prison companies, then Corrections Corporation of America, recently rebranded CoreCivic, and GEO, opened family detention centers in Karnes City, Texas, and in Dilley, Texas, which is down the road from the site of a former Japanese internment camp. The administration also continues to use a smaller 100-bed detention center in Burke. So here we have Karnes, that again is fairly remote. It's 2.5 hours from Austin and about an hour from San Antonio. And here is Dilley, which is almost 2 hours from San Antonio. And then Burke's, which is an hour outside Philadelphia. And I want to pause just a minute to focus on the corporate actors, CoreCivic and GEO primarily, who are the largest stakeholders in this in the private prison industry. In the United States, detention is a big part of immigration enforcement, whether we're talking about children, families, or single adults. Congress has actually established a 34,000 bed quota, which is extraordinary. In no other justice context do you find a law requiring a certain number of detention beds. 70% of these detention beds are owned or operated by private prison companies. These companies facilitated the growth. They really were the easy answer provided to the administration in response to the 2014 surge. And they have facilitated the growth of family detention and other control mechanisms over asylum seekers. So the moms who are now in Karnes and Dilley, when they are released with electronic monitoring devices, or grilletes, as the women call them, around their ankles, that's borrowed from the corrections world. And those electronic monitors came from a subsidiary of GEO. GEO also won a contract for the only government sponsored community-based alternative to detention program. So these companies are everywhere and providing kind of all levels of the solution that the administration under Obama and has now continued with the current administration. But in looking to stop family detention, advocates turn to the Flores Settlement Agreement, which established minimum treatment standards for children in immigration custody and has been in force, binding the government since the mid-1990s. And despite the administration's position that the agreement only applied to unaccompanied children, the federal court applied Flores to children detained with their mothers. So regardless of whether the child is alone in immigration custody or alongside a parent, most likely a mother in immigration custody. The litigation is ongoing. It has resulted in shortened detention time. So now most of the families are detained about 20 days. But we do have some families that have remained detained for years, and most of those long-term family detainees are at this Burke facility. Now, since January, the aggressive enforcement and national security focused model has continued. Jayesh mentioned the targeting of parents and relative caretakers of immigrant children. The administration has made repealing critical protection for children a legislative priority. He's pushing, the president is pushing for this repeal currently in exchange for legislation that would give legal status to the hundreds of thousands of so-called dreamers of young immigrants who grew up in the United States but still lack immigration status. We also hear rhetoric from the Attorney General against migrant children. He has declared legal protections for asylum seekers to be loopholes. So international legal obligations, refugee protections are all of a sudden, loopholes in U.S. immigration law. He has called child migrants in particular wolves in sheep's clothing. And we've also seen really cruel enforcement against children in particular. The most recent example has been Rosa Maria Hernandez here in Texas, who's a 10-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who was arrested by Border Patrol on her way to receive emergency gallbladder surgery. Border Patrol stationed outside the hospital room, and when she was released, took her into custody and transferred her into an ORR facility, again, one of the kinds that Jayesh mentioned, even though her parents had been providing an absolutely stable and loving home, are here in the United States, and she is no way unaccompanied. The ACLU, the NYU Clinic, and our Civil Rights Clinic have sued for her immediate release, and that litigation remains pending. She remains in detention at one of the ORR facilities in San Antonio. And of course, the Rosa Maria case comes on the heels of ORR also refusing to transport a child to receive an abortion where she had received all legal authorization from the Texas state court to do so. So it's a very troubling time toward the advancement of rights of migrant children. The advocates community is largely trying to hold on to what we have, in the hopes of an opportunity at some point in the future to stabilize continued protection for immigrant children. With that, I think we are at a close and would love to hear continuing questions.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. And please do send clarifying questions for Alyssa momentarily, or in the next couple of minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to collate our first round of questions, which are extremely thought-provoking and may take us a while to go through. I think you all have understood quickly that this is an extremely knowledgeable group of experts who have shared these presentations with us, so a big thank you to all of you. The first question is actually from me, and it is, when I have thought about the title of this presentation, the use of the word refugee, and within UN circles and within international humanitarian circles, that is an extremely loaded term. It comes with an entire set of protections that are not available to people who are displaced for economic reasons, supposedly, as if we can easily divorce political and economic persecution or realities. So just a quick, if possible, your thoughts on the use of the word refugees to apply to these children and youth. And also, Jayesh, you made mention of the fact that the unaccompanied status refers to their crossing at the border. And I have done quite a bit of research around what unaccompanied and separated children means in the international arena. And what I have come to understand is that the concept of a child separated from their family is not always properly operationalized by agencies working with these children, and that children who are not indeed separated in any sense of the word from what are customarily acceptable living arrangements are then classified as such, and what the implications of that may be. For the second question, the first one then is around the language and the use of the words refugee and unaccompanied children. The second one's around money. And Ariel Carroll has asked, how will U.S. foreign aid and budget cuts have an impact on this population, and what opportunities for private and philanthropic sector engagement are? To that, I would add a question that has come from Sam Munyuwini, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, about whether or not this was directed to Alyssa, but I think any of our panelists could answer it. Is there a cost-benefit analysis of how much the United States spends on the care of refugee children when they've arrived in the country compared to the cost of supporting development and pro-democracy projects in their home countries? Should NGOs and civil society organizations be advocating to the Trump administration that a pro-international community engagement strategy is cheaper than an America First policy, or I think perhaps a detention and deportation model is what is being referred to there. Finally, another question from Sam Munyuwini, and I see there are some new questions coming in. We'll get them in the next round. Who is the head of research at the African Institute for Children's Studies at www.institutechildstudies.org, and currently a research fellow at the Southwest Interdisciplinary Research Institute in Arizona, which is one of the Institute's collaborators. He appreciates the statistics that demonstrate the pipeline of impunity, corruption, and I would add violence in the Northern Triangle region of Central America, and the need for that impunity and corruption to be ended if there is going to be a stop to the drivers of this flight. To what extent, I think this is a strategy question, is the role of America playing a big brother plausible today? Even if it looks like the most sustainable intervention, is it feasible? UNODC, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, seems to be failing in a big brother role. Is there an alternative strategy that might be strengthening civil society organizations in the countries? So those are three very meaty questions, I think. So I will pass it over to you, and you can decide what order you would like to answer them in. And I will add that Kate and Mariana, we've seen your questions and we'll bring them to the panelists in the next round.
Well, those are wonderful questions. I'm thinking in terms of how we divide them up, perhaps Jayesh and Elisa could address the refugee and UAC definitional questions. I can say some things about these questions regarding foreign aid budget cuts and what role there might be for civil society organizations, as well as the role of the United States and civil society organizations in the region. And Dennis has also looked a bit at the categorization of people as UACs or refugees. Perhaps we should start with those questions, though.
Jayesh, I'm gonna defer to you and Alyssa.
Sure.
On
Sure, I'm happy to offer just a few reflections. Then Alyssa, feel free to, whatever you'd like to add as well. In terms of the terminological question around, are these individuals properly classified as refugees? It's an interesting question because, of course, as a legal scholar, I'm always looking at what the statute says, and even there, of course, we have an international definition that comes from the Refugee Convention, but then that definition has been subject to different interpretations at the country level. And so you'll see some parts of the world that have broader definitions of refugees, and other parts of the world, including in the United States in some respects, that have kind of more narrowly tailored definitions of refugees. And I think in the broadest sense, we think of a refugee as somebody who's fleeing some kind of danger or persecution and is in need of protection. And there's no question that many of the people who are coming out of Central America, including the unaccompanied minors, would satisfy that definition. Now, once we get into the particulars of the legal definition, the Refugee Convention and national law typically requires that the individual is fleeing some kind of harm or feared harm that's being perpetrated or would be perpetrated for a particular reason, right? Because of the minor or the individual's race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. And so what we're finding is that in the case of many Central American migrants, it's difficult to exactly classify the experiences and the things that they are fearing into kind of the boxes that have been established under international law and U.S. law. And we have made some progress in certain areas, but for many Central American migrants, it remains difficult to precisely articulate their claims in a way that satisfies existing requirements. And there's a lot, of course, of litigation that's being done and creative lawyering around how to frame those claims and how to move the law forward, but that remains a perennial challenge. And I'll just say a word about the classification as unaccompanied children, and I'm sure Alyssa will have more to add to this, but just that it's kind of going in both directions, right? So I think Alyssa gave a good example of this individual, the young girl who with cerebral palsy who has parents, yet is getting forced into the ORR system. But then another trend that we're seeing recently is individuals who had initially been classified as unaccompanied alien children, and then the government is moving to terminate that designation because there are certain legal benefits that accrue as a result of having that designation. So yes, certainly there is some fluidity there in terms of how individuals are being categorized and different government imperatives that are pushing folks into the designation or out of the designation.
And this is Alyssa. Just to add on the language of refugee, I think it's really interesting. I agree with everything that Jayesh has said in terms of the U.S. context, recognizing that many of these children, most of these children, are crossing through Mexico, which of course has the benefit of looking to the Cartagena Declaration, which has a broader definition of a refugee, and there we are seeing as the enforcement at the U.S. southern border becomes more and more aggressive and militarized, that children are having to become refugees and state their claim in Mexico, which offers a broader, so it really is, I think it's an appropriate term, not just for the United States, but also as we look at this issue regionally. And if I could just, on the question of the cost benefit, there has been some really interesting, I mean, one is just obviously the test for asylum for refugee status should never be looked at in terms of a cost benefit. It's either, is someone recognized as a refugee, period, once they make it to the United States. But in terms of establishing broader policy and particularly foreign policy, there has been a fascinating analysis of the costs of what it would take to reduce the level of even just the homicide rate in the Northern Triangle versus the cost of the detention, deportation mechanisms that we have spent our money on in the United States. And it does come out that it would be much more fiscally responsible to invest in overseas in trying to even marginally reduce the rate of violence in the Northern Triangle than pushing for greater enforcement investment in the United States.
just to pick up on that, this is Eric Hirschberg. I think Elisa is absolutely right, and there are there's a growing body of literature that's making this point. I think, you know, the alliance, the plan for the Alliance for Prosperity in the region would be the answer of the Obama administration to those who would say one needs to invest in changing the conditions on the ground. I think that there are several problems with that initiative as it was formulated, and as so far it appears this Congress will continue to fund, though I think there's a question mark about that over the medium term, but at least in this year's budget there is a continuing commitment to funding this. And there, I think, two key assumptions that I think are worth pointing out. I mean, the first is that if one invests in infrastructure that will contribute to the prosperity of the Northern Triangle private sector, that will somehow trickle down to improving the conditions faced by the segment of the population that is most vulnerable to violence and that is experiencing greatest degrees of hardship, and that thus is the population most likely to migrate. And it seems to me that there is a great leap of faith there that is perhaps not justified. Creating the conditions for the prosperity of the private sector in those countries has not historically created conditions for the private sectors to invest in ways that are either employment creating or service providing for the majority of the populations in those countries. And this goes to the fundamentally political problem in the region of exclusionary political systems that have been captured by small factions of elites who govern in their own interests rather than the interests of society as a whole. And in turn, we see this when we look at what happens with the health and social security funds in countries such as Honduras and Guatemala, where we find that political elites are channeling those resources into shadow companies and into bribes to their political supporters and into campaign funds and the like, rather than into health and social services. And increasing the pool of resources available to them to do that is not going to resolve the problem of, say, more than a third of the Guatemalan youth being undernourished. And we just don't have any evidence of increased resources flowing into those institutions translating into expenditures in the public interest. Now, it is the case that through mechanisms such as the Anti-Impunity Commissions, both the UN-sponsored in Guatemala and the OAS-sponsored, much more recent in Honduras, there is an effort in principle to go after precisely these kinds of phenomena. But the question there ultimately is whether these institutions will have the backing that they need from abroad, and whether civil society in the region will have the capability it needs to push those institutions so that they have a lasting impact. As I mentioned, there have been efforts both by the incumbent administrations in both Guatemala and Honduras to undermine the operation of these anti-impunity commissions. And the question becomes, what will their sponsors in the international community and do about that? How will they respond? And I would say that in the Guatemalan case, we've seen the United States government take a fairly decisive stance in favor of the commission. And that's actually been the case under the Trump administration as well. Interestingly, there seems to be bipartisan support for the commission. And there's discussion now of withholding visas for Guatemalan elites who have been trying to undermine the commission. In my view, in Honduras, the record has been much less decisive. But that's an area in which I don't think the United States can by any means play big brother, and I don't think the United States can be the solution, but it can contribute. At the same time that failing to act, it can contribute to maintaining the status quo. At the same time, I think fundamentally, civil society, which includes supported by non-governmental, non-profit sectors outside the country as well as within, has to play a fundamental role. And here, to understand Central America in 2017, we have to situate the region historically in the context of the past more than half century of exclusionary political systems, of extractive economic systems. And these are environments that are very, very difficult for an autonomous civil society to act in ways that reflect empowerment and that demand accountability from both political and economic elites. And so civil society is key to the solution, but these are societies with very weak civil societies, and for reasons that have to do with the kinds of exclusion that have characterized them for many decades, and which we must say, I mean, the United States for a very long time supported political systems and contributed to exacerbating civil wars in countries such as Guatemala and El Salvador that have brought us to the point where we are today, and where reforming these political economies in ways that will make it possible for the majority of the population to live dignified and safe lives is an extraordinarily tall task.
Indeed. Thank you for addressing all of those questions quite comprehensively. A few more questions have come through that I think build on the responses that you just gave. Kate Roberts has asked, and I think you've already begun to go through some of this, whether what your impressions are of how various countries in Latin America, and that may extend beyond the 3 countries in question, are reacting to the increases in migrant flows, which for them are outpopulations. Are they following the U.S. lead or treating the young people as deserving of protection? And I think embedded in that question is an understanding that the U.S. lead is that it is not treating young people as deserving of protection. Mariana Cruz Murueta has asked, based on all of your research and experience, what would be a good strategy to start tackling this huge problem? Things are not going to change quickly in the short term, and for many people, flight and leaving is the only option. And finally, a very interesting and nuanced question from Carmen Madreñan. Can you discuss how the legal frameworks within which private and public sector entities operating detention facilities operate differently, and what are the implications for the children and families we're discussing? So let's do the reverse order this time. Let's do Eric and Dennis and Alyssa, and then end with Jayesh. And I think that is all of our questions, and we're coming up to an hour and a half now. So don't hesitate to send more questions, but we may not have another round. So over to the 4 of you once again.
So just very quickly, and thank you, not only Mark, but all of the participants in this webinar for very interesting questions. My sense, and others, my colleagues may know more about this, my sense is that for the most part, the response in other countries in the region has been not systematic, has been one of great preoccupation for a lack of capacity to properly adjudicate these claims. There is a discussion in Mexico about the need to bring up to date Mexico's asylum system and the need for an array of services to support what is going to be a growing population of, let's call them refugees, from Central America in Mexico. And of course, this in the broader context of Mexico's very fraught relationship with the current administration in Washington. But my sense is that things remain very ill-defined. And my sense is that if there is a silver lining in the draconian positions that this administration is taking in the United States, perhaps it is that the depth of repudiation of this administration by countries throughout the hemisphere may well motivate one or another to try to establish examples of how these things are supposed to be done. But I think at this point, it's too early to see how countries like Panama and Costa Rica and Belize are going to grapple with this flow of migrants that, again, given how small these countries are, is of a magnitude that really should not be underestimated.
Alyssa, thoughts on these last questions? And I think you'll be especially well placed to talk about public and private detention facilities.
Sure, I'll start with that one. Essentially, whether public or private, and to be clear, both. So the public engagement with immigration detention is usually the same monetary contract relationship with the Department of Homeland Security. So the Department of Homeland Security says we're looking for detention beds in Austin, Texas, and Travis County Jail would say, great, we have, a whole wing that we'd like to free up, so let's establish the contract for 250 beds. That's the same contract relationship with the private corporations. The issue, obviously, because the private sector has the vast majority of beds, and because they are profit driven, we often see the conditions in those facilities poorer and of concern, and there is very little. I mean, DHS, while they say they provide oversight, there is very little, and there's no there are detention standards that apply equally to the public or private detention spaces, but they are non-enforceable. We can't go to court. An individual who is detained, who is being denied critical medical care, can't go to court and say the detention facility is violating the detention standards, which has been so challenging in terms of pushing for any reform. And of course, alongside that, the underlying assumption that detention is even appropriate for immigrants is the one that's really being pushed and is hard to. There's just not a lot of opportunity to litigate on that, although there are a lot of efforts. In terms of the broader question of what might be a good strategy going forward, I think the best strategy, which is the most unrealistic one in the current landscape, is a legalization program. While the push factors are very real in terms of the violence in Central America, many of the particularly kids we see, as Jayesh mentioned, I think a majority are reuniting with parents here. So if there was a way to give the parents, and oftentimes the parents have like the temporary protected status, but it doesn't allow for them to bring their children and reunify with family members. So if there was a legalization program, the continuance of TPS, particularly for the Salvadorans, is so critical. I think, otherwise we're going to see mass return and further destabilization in El Salvador, and we will have, that in my mind. I'm not a international development person, but is the best direct development program that the U.S. has going right now. I think also that there just needs to be, better safe migration pathways in general for the children in particular. And again, maybe with Mexico, Belize, Panama, Costa Rica stepping up a little bit, those opportunities might come. But with so much of the family unity happening here in the United States, I just worry that the family unity component will be left behind, even if kids find safety in neighboring countries and not the U.S.
Thank
Yes,
you.
and I'll just
Go right ahead, Jayesh. I was just going to ask if you had
okay.
final thoughts.
Yes, just a few quick thoughts just to complement what Alyssa offered. And, I would agree that with respect to, other possibilities, I think Eric and Alyssa have identified the challenges, right? There are countries in the region that might be able to absorb some of the refugee flows, but number one, are they prepared to do so infrastructurally? And number two, as Alyssa just mentioned, are the Central Americans interested in going there, right? Do they have family ties there? Do they have Central American communities there that they would feel comfortable in? And just to give an example, there is a small but growing population of Central American migrants who are making the way up to Canada. And certainly, in general, the refugee adjudication system is seen universally as being a little bit more hospitable in Canada than it is in the United States, but there's no family ties or other community connections that would lead the Central American population to there. Now, perhaps that will grow over time, but right now it's not going to be a large-scale solution. And I would just add that as far as the options, right now the forms of relief that we have from a lawyering perspective and an administrative perspective are highly inefficient. And by that I mean it requires an immense amount of resources on the part of the government and on the part of attorneys and the migrants themselves to put forth claims. And all of this, of course, in the face of what everyone recognizes as a humanitarian crisis. And so, I do think we need to be thinking about group-based types of protection. It's not really going to happen with the current administration in Washington, D.C. But just to build on the TPS thing, something that Eric and I have advocated for in the past is a new designation of TPS for Central America, not based on the natural disasters of the late 90s and 2000, 2001, but based on current conditions, which would at least offer some minimal protection to the folks who are here in the country. Again, not a permanent solution, and it places people in kind of a, as it's been referred to as a liminal legality, right? Not having a formal permanent status, but it may create some efficiencies and offer protection, while what I also think needs to happen is for there to be more of a regional and hemispheric dialogue and solution for the Central American migration crisis, as opposed to kind of every country just figuring it out on its own.
Thank you so much, Jayesh. We are at time now, and in the chat box we have put links to all of the institutes and clinics where our various presenters work and research and do amazing work at the intersection of research and practice. A big thank you again to Eric Hirschberg and Dennis Stinchcomb of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, Jayesh Ratod of the Law School at American University, and Alyssa Steglish at University of Texas's Immigration Clinic. Everyone who participated and others who registered will receive the recording and all of these resources tomorrow. Thank you so much to everyone. It is heartening to hear such articulate and passionate defenses of humanity in the face of very difficult times and challenges in a variety of countries that have created the maelstrom that these children and their families find themselves in. So it is just very heartening to know that you are doing this work, and we're very glad to be able to share it with our own small network. So thanks to you all. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.